Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Darrin McMahon, who is a professor of history at Dartmouth University and the author of a number of really fantastic books. I guess the most recent one is this one called Equality, the History of an Elusive Idea, preceded by, I think I got this right, the order correct, Divine Fury, a History of Genius, and that was preceded by Happiness, a History. Welcome, Darrin.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Now, look, all of these books, I mean, I don't know how you would describe this. What is it, like longue durée intellectual history, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of an unfashionable way of doing things, I guess, in history departments. I mean, I just absolutely loved these books because in all of them, you go back to the ancient Greeks. In fact, you go back to our primate ancestors in one of these books and then work your way all the way forward to the present. And I think there's also these interesting connections between them all. Similar characters show up and similar themes. And you can tell that in one of the books, it's almost, there's the germ of the next book embedded in there. And so I guess the first question I have for you is, what do we call this kind of history, and why is it that you've decided to take on yourself this type of longue durée intellectual history?
Sure. Well, it's a great question, and as you say, it was for a long time unfashionable. I was trained as a graduate student in Cambridge School Intellectual History, which was, kind of close contextual history, studying discourses in context, recreating the world in which they were formed. I also got a strong dose of the social history of ideas. This was underneath my supervisor, David Bell, who was a student of Robert Darnton, who was a kind of pioneer in that field. And that was kind of marrying cultural history and social history, and again, looking at close context. My first book was conformed in that mode. This was this book, Enemies of the Enlightenment, which talked about the kind of origins of the religious right in France in the second half of the 18th century. But then I had a funny experience. I sort of finished this dissertation. I was very proud of it, still am. But it was a dissertation, so 30 or 40 people in the world were interested in it, if that. And my parents, who all along kind of wanted me to go to law school or medical school, were sort of scratching their head and looking at me, wondering, why I spent so much time on this. Couldn't I do something that more people were interested in? And I did have an idea for a book that would have a kind of broader reach. And this was this history of happiness. I was teaching as a postdoc at Columbia and reading the canon, which I'd never read, although I'd claimed to. And happiness just seemed to leap off the pages there from Plato and Aristotle forward. And I thought, well, this would make a great subject for a book. But I came at it in this kind of in some ways great books, canonical way. And I just set out and did it. And I found it interesting. And it was only after the fact, really, when I then went to write this book on genius, that I started to think about methodologically what a longue durée history of ideas would entail. And as you probably know, there was a time in which this kind of history was done. And, the great name in American intellectual history is Arthur Lovejoy, who was German emigre who taught at Johns Hopkins for many years, and wrote a book that's
just a great chain of being, right?
A great chain of being, which is still well worth reading. And he founded the Journal of the History of Ideas, and he and his students wrote these histories of concepts over millennia. That went out of fashion in many ways for good reasons, in part because it was kind of really the history of philosophy, and ideas floated around in the clouds and they anticipated one another. And, there was this kind of a great chain where Plato hands the baton to Aristotle and so on down the road. And so in the 1960s, that kind of work began to fall out of favor. But what I've tried to argue, and I've written some methodological essays about this, that the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. And, there is value to looking at the longue durée. I mean, there's a famous, trope in French intellectual history that historians need to be both truffle hunters and parachutists. This is la durée, that truffle hunters get up close to the ground. They look, in minute detail at what's in front of them. And parachutists come in from high and see the lay of the land and get a sense of the whole. And I think history needs both. And I've turned my attention in recent years to the kind of parachuting phenomena. But that's not to discount the importance of hunting for truffles.
Right. And so when you're doing this kind of history, I mean, in one sense, you are studying how a word or a concept sort of evolves over time. But those are sort of different things, right? Because the word changes meaning. So you could either kind of follow the concept, and through all of the different linguistic changes, or you could kind of follow the word through all of the different meaning changes, right?
Absolutely, and in many ways, I try to do both. You're absolutely right to say that words and concepts are distinct. The words change, and so do the concepts. But the words often give you, insight or clues into them. So, this history of happiness that I wrote. It's really interesting that the words for happiness in every Indo-European language are cognate with luck.
Yeah.
The modern sort of Romance languages and Anglo-Saxon words for English come in the late Middle Ages. So happiness, the root
Like
of happiness,
felicitas, right?
exactly. Well, so that's the Latin from the Latin felix, meaning fate. But in English, the root is hap, which is an Old Norse and Old English word, and it gives us words like happenstance or perhaps or happens, and it just means luck. And so luck or fate, which is a way of controlling what happens to you that's outside your hands. This shows up time and time again, and it turns out this is a really interesting kind of insight into the way that people, I think, have long thought about happiness, and that is that it's something that happens to you, but you can't control. Happiness is in the hands of the gods or the fates or fortune, and just when you think things are going well for you, like in Greek tragedy, then a piano falls on your head, or the world goes to hell, and it's only really beginning in Greece in the fourth century, fifth and fourth centuries, although you find analogs in almost every religious tradition, that people start to say, no, our happiness, our fate in life is in many respects in our hands. And so by controlling the way that we live, how we act, how we relate to one another and to the gods, we can in some ways predetermine our fate or ensure our happiness. And that sets a kind of pursuit of happiness off that we continue to this day. So that's a way in which a word and a concept are linked, even if those two are distinct.
Well, I think I forget who it was who said that the history of philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. But I mean, you could also kind of say that, right, the history of all of these concepts are sort of footnotes to Plato, right? I mean, that's sort of where you begin all of the three books in a way, right?
Yeah,
It's just,
so I'm
there's a
doing
discontinuity that
intellectual
happens.
history, and I was trained in intellectual history, and I like reading Plato, and I always tell people that I'm a classicist manqué, that in my next life I would be a classicist, and I like the classics. But take happiness. I mean, happiness is an idea that has a long philosophical history, and you're right. It in many ways begins with Plato, but happiness is something today, and arguably for many centuries, of interest to everyone. And so, to begin and end with Plato would be to kind of limit things. But what I do try to do is follow a philosophical conversation that becomes a religious conversation, that then becomes a much wider cultural and societal conversation. And I think there are ways in which these conversations are connected and linked over time.
And it seems like in the history of happiness, right, the same debates keep happening over and over again, right? So, for instance, the contrast between sort of um, what we might think of as simple pleasures and sort of some form of higher satisfaction or fulfillment, right?
Exactly. So hedonism versus a kind of meaning. And you're absolutely right. These things play out over and over again. I like to tease my psychologist friends. Since the happiness book came out, I've done a lot of work with psychologists and positive psychologists in particular who study, the kind of
Subjective
form.
well-being, right? That's what we call it. you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this has been really interesting for me because it's allowed me to kind of be in dialogue with folks who do work very different from my own. But this has gone on for some time now. And I always like to tease the psychologists. They think that they're uh, discovering new things all the time. And well, yes and no, but it turns out that many of the things they're discovering actually have been known and passed on through the wisdom traditions. So
Like
my friend
poetry
John.
versus pushpin, right? Was
Yeah,
that was Mill or
okay,
Bentham, right?
right, Bentham, yeah, exactly. But my friend John Haidt, the social psychologist who's writes about all kinds of things now, and is a big public intellectual.
His first
John's
book was
first
on happiness. Yeah.
was on happiness, and the subtitle of that book, The Happiness Hypothesis, was finding modern truth and ancient wisdom. And one thing that John does in that book, which is just wonderful, is sort of take contemporary social psychology and look at it in the light of the wisdom traditions, the religious traditions, and John would be the first to admit that a lot of the quote unquote discoveries of positive psychologists have actually been known for a long time and passed on and cultivated in religious and wisdom traditions.
Yeah, I like this connection between the happiness book and the book on divine fury, right? Because you're talking about this, the daimon, right?
Yeah.
Who's out there, sort of impacting you in some way.
Absolutely. So, that it's funny. I told you I wrote this first book on enemies of the Enlightenment, people who fought against the Enlightenment and were opposed to the philosophers, the great philosophers of the 18th century. And my initial idea for that book was to write about a history of the intellectual, a history of the kind of birth of the philosopher as a new cultural animal, new cultural type related to this birth of genius. And I was told at the time, that's far too ambitious a subject for a dissertation. And so I ended up writing about the enemies, but I had the idea of doing something on the kind of the animal that is the intellectual or the genius. And that led to the next book, Divine Fury, A History of Genius. But you're absolutely right. There are these connections. So the main word for happiness in ancient Greek, or well-being or flourishing, doesn't translate perfectly to our happiness, certainly, but has that connotation of well-being or flourishing. It's formed from the Greek prefix eu, meaning good, and then, as you point out, daimon, which is the root of our modern word demon, although for the Greeks it doesn't have the kind of connotation of evil that it gets with Christianity. And the idea there is that
There's good demons and bad demons, right?
good demons and bad demons, and they lead you where they will. And again, you don't have control over this. So if you have a good demon, you're fortunate, you're lucky that your good daimon will lead you in good places. And if you have a bad one, it will lead you astray. So that's an idea that gets kind of cultivated in the tradition of happiness.
And I didn't realize how central this notion was to Plato. I mean, Socrates has this demon that's
Exactly. So
egging him on all the time. Like I didn't. I
exactly.
mean,
So if
after
you read any Plato's dialogues, you'll know that that Socrates claimed to have this kind of private spirit or sign that accompanied him and would keep him from doing things. And a mythology develops around that after his death, and you get the idea that Socrates, who is reputed to be the wisest man in the ancient world, had not just a daimon, but a particularly powerful daimon that didn't just keep him from doing things, but kind of whispered the secrets of the gods into his mind, and this is the source of his power. And a whole way of thinking about intellectual creativity and insight and wisdom develops around this idea that the special benighted person is in contact or traffic with the gods, and that they infuse into us their knowledge or wisdom. And this is really at the root of the idea of inspiration, which comes from the Latin word inspirare, which means to
or
breathe,
enthusiasm,
right? Sorry?
Or enthusiasm.
Yeah,
Enthusiasm also.
and that's exactly, and that's the Greek version exactly. That you're in direct, sort of conversation with the gods. That they blow you up. Now Plato thought, Plato, as disparaged the poets, and the poets are the ones who always, the rhapsodists, think of themselves as channeling the gods. So at the very beginning of Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you get this incantation to the gods: "Sing in me, muse," right? Breathe into me. And Plato says, well, that's, kind of like being a windbag, and poets have nothing of their own. They're just blown into by others and, puffed up. And of course, he's mocking them. But this becomes this very powerful idea of how the superhuman figures, get access to superhuman knowledge, and again, that can go astray. So, you can have a bad daimon, right, or you can have an evil genius that can whisper, naughty things into your mind, and that tradition goes on and on and on. I don't know if you've ever read Thomas Mann's great novel, Dr. Faustus. But in many ways, this is the kind of culmination of this 2,500-year rumination on the connection between genius and evil. And the protagonist of that book is a great composer, and he contracts syphilis, and there's a connection to the kind of sexual degeneration that leads to genius, which is a kind of fun story in its own right in the 19th century. And Adrien Lefercun, the protagonist, then becomes this brilliant genius composer, but really at the price of his soul. And the whole book is a kind of metaphor for the rise of fascism. But it's just fascinating, and it links to this long rumination on connections between genius and madness and evil.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that you couldn't have a concept of genius the way we do now until Christianity sort of got out of the way, right? Because I mean, the Christian view was that only God can create, and so anything you create is really you're like the vessel, right? You're the agent of God.
Right, that there's nothing new under the sun, right? There's a great scholastic phrase that solus Deus creat, that God alone creates. God alone can bring something new into the universe. And so there's a long early modern rumination on the idea that, all ideas that are out there are just found ideas, right?
Like discoveries. That's what discovery means, right?
Discover,
it's just
uncover, or
yeah.
to even invent, that word comes from the Latin invenire, which means to come upon, right? To stumble upon. So human beings don't invent for themselves, and it's only when you get a kind of new epistemology that allows for human beings to think of themselves as creators that you can have geniuses. Now, you referred to something else, which is a kind of important part of my argument, and that is that there's this older pre-18th century discussion about having a genius or having access to genius. But it's really only in the 18th century that people start to refer to individuals as geniuses who embody this power.
So a genius was like a figure, right?
A spirit. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. They would even, and I think you showed that picture in Pompeii of, like, you're the genius. It's kind of like a muse, or
exactly. So this older Greek idea of having a daimon and gets taken up by the Romans, and what they call a daimon is a genius, a genius. It's the exact same word as genius, just pronounced a little differently. And the idea,
which means to create, right? Or to
it comes from the verb. We're talking about lots of words here, but this is great. I love words. Genogenere, which is the verb to generate, right? Or to, and it's cognate with gene and genitals and so forth.
Genesis.
Yes, exactly. And so a genius was a guardian spirit. All men were believed to have a genius. You celebrated your genius on effectively your birthday, on your genius day, right? And they're even...
It's like a patron saint, right?
Well, so the idea of a patron saint is in many ways linked to this, right? Or having and in fact, there's a Christianization of this Roman cult of the genius in the kind of guardian angel or guardian demon, right? And so, a genius in this older classical sense is this kind of spirit figure that one can be in contact with, traffic with, and then this gets, played with in the early modern period, where you start, you get into kind of forms of magic and astrology. We're trying to contact these intermediary beings who stand between individuals in the heavens and gods, and who can be contacted. And of course, that sounds dangerously like magic, and Christians don't like magic. But there are all kinds of people playing with this. And again, this leads to this Faust idea, right? That, Faust is kind of in traffic with the devil, and this gives him privileged access to secrets. And Lucifer, remember, is the greatest of the angels, right? And renowned for his wisdom. But there's a cost to be had for that. And so that gets played with in fun ways in the early modern period. But by the 18th century, there's a kind of willful discounting of guardian angels and demons and really intermediary beings of all sorts, including saints. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that the genius figure emerges in the 18th century in part to kind of fill that void. And geniuses become for us from that period on these mediating figures who somehow stand between us and the divine, who translate the heavens to us. And you think of an Einstein, right, who says, well, he's joking to some degree that he can kind of speak with the heavens, right, that he can interpret God's voice. But this is how we think about him, right? He's disclosing secrets of the universe to us. And translating kind of our longings. Geniuses do this, great writers, great artists, and so forth. And I think this accounts for their enduring power in the 19th and 20th century. And there are all these kind of fun parallels with saints. So I point out there's a whole cult of relics in the 19th century where people are trying to, literally get the body parts of geniuses, the finger bone of Goya or Beethoven, the skull of Kant or Voltaire, the penis of Napoleon. I write a whole bunch about this crazy effort, right, to kind of to capture the penis of Napoleon, and I don't know, venerate it, but there's this idea that somehow the power of genius is still inherent in the flesh. So anyway, it's there's a lot of fun stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of where a lot of the Christian ways of thinking, they just sort of reappear in
Yeah.
post-Christian context. And a lot of the things that you described earlier are Roman or pagan concepts that kind of find their way into Christianity. And so in many ways, the book is, I mean, I know there's a big debate between what splitters and joiners, but it seems like,
Yeah.
the book, a lot of it is about walking through these continuities, but then you also emphasize these distinct sort of breaking points. And on the concept of genius, I mean, I think it went back even further. So Michelangelo, I think you say, is sort of a seminal figure, a really important figure, because people would venerate him. They thought of him as this incredible creative individual.
Absolutely. So the Renaissance is kind of in this period of transition where people are going from thinking about having special capacities or having a genius or having ingenium is the other word, a kind of implanted natural ability, and then our need to cultivate that through practice, through us and repetition. But they also developed this cult of the super artist, right? And you get this in Vasari's Lives of the Painters, where he, refers to Michael of the Angels, right? As divine. He uses the term divino to describe him, which had only been used previously to describe saints. And when Michelangelo dies and his body is brought to Florence, to Santa Croce Cathedral from Rome, this story develops that his body is not decaying because, like a saint, it's preserved immaculate and intact. And so the Renaissance begins this kind of way of talking about artists or intellectuals as higher beings, and that gets picked up on later by the Romantics, who have their own cult of genius and who look back to some of the great Renaissance painters and poets, and kind of deify them as geniuses after the fact. You said something, Gregory, that I appreciate very much. I mean, you talked about splitters and joiners, and the way in which, in many ways, I'm trying in my work to, yes, identify points of inflection or change, but also to point out continuities. And this is really important to me, and I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think that one of the main thrusts of what counts as intellectual history since the 1970s, and you see this in somebody like Michel Foucault, is to focus more on the rupture, on the discontinuities, on the changes, and less on the continuities. And there's also been a kind of foreshortening of the time scale, so that I mentioned the Cambridge School before, really wonderful work coming out of it, but often it's quite focused on narrow temporal periods, even if, of Quentin Skinner and J.G.A. Pocock, some of the founders of the Cambridge School, looked in their own work at quite long trajectories. Many of their students have focused on the narrower. And when you focus on the narrower, what you do see or tend to see is change and less continuities that endure over time. And I think these continuities are also really important. And as you say, in reflection on happiness, or reflection on creativity and genius, on reflection on equality, when you take a look over the longue durée, you begin to see the way that, that as the French say, le plus que ça change, le plus que c'est la même chose, the more that things change, the more they are the same thing.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, you can't do a history of equality without talking about its opposite, right? So inequality is a necessary part of equality, but you do the same thing with happiness, right? So, you have to explore what it means to not be happy. And I think in the happiness book and in the genius book, there's this common theme, which is there are some people who make sure to emphasize that the only way to really be happy is to be unhappy, right? What these geniuses are suffering, right? And the cult of the painful artist. And what's interesting about that is that in modern times we have these economists, for instance. I'm an economist now at this point, where they have a relatively simplistic view of utility and subjective well-being that stems from Bentham. But in the culture at large, right, we do have this notion of the anguish of the genius and so forth, and struggle and so forth. So it seems like these themes never change. We have these debates now as vividly as we did 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, so you're out in Berkeley. I was an undergraduate at Berkeley and loved the place and had a wonderful time there. But I always joke, partly at myself, that when I was an undergraduate, I wore black all the time and I smoked cigarettes and I thought about death. And in my mind, that was what, intellectuals did, right? And of course, that is a mythology.
I've got my memento. I've got my memento mori on my my phone.
Perfect. That's a mythology that really dates to the Romantics in the 19th century. But as your painting on your phone there points out, and your reference to the memento mori, it's also deeply embedded in a Christian notion that who is Jesus? Jesus is the man of discontent, the man of suffering, right? Who suffers for us and brings a higher truth into the world. And so that idea is deeply embedded in our culture. And I discovered this vividly when I started to write about happiness. And as I mentioned earlier, I kind of stumbled upon this through teaching at Columbia and reading the canon. But it was in the air. The Bobby McFerrin song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy," was in the air, and people were thinking about happiness. And when I started,
and you even talk about the history of the little smiley icon.
Exactly, the smiley face, right, which comes into being in the 1970s and becomes a kind of modern icon. When I started to talk about this in academic circles, people looked at me like, well, that's a kind of weird subject, because they associated happiness somehow with superficiality, with kind of advertising, with capitalism in its worst instantiations. And so I had to push back and say, actually, no, happiness is a very deep subject, maybe the deepest. And not only that, but it's deeply embedded in the Western intellectual tradition, going all the way back to the Greeks, who ask as their foundational question, what is the good life? And as I've argued elsewhere, I think really every major religious tradition is posing that question. What does it mean to live well, and how to go about it? And so, that's not a superficial question. That is the question. And yet, and somehow we allow our kind of prejudices that are passed on over the ages to get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, somewhere in the book on equality, you quoted a philosopher who said that all political philosophies value equality, right? That's sort of the end of all of them, right? And so the debates are all about, well, what is it here, and what are how do you circumscribe it, and who does it apply to, and what equality of what exactly?
What and for whom? This is was the question that Aristotle posed, and but many people after him. Not everyone values equality. I think it's important to say, and that becomes more true, I think, after the 18th century. But even well before it, a lot of people are interested in equality, and I think the point that I would stress, and that you're making really, is that a lot of people you wouldn't expect value equality. And so I have a whole chapter
Like
on
the fascists. I mean,
ideas of equality, right? Which is
yeah.
something that, just seems inherently counterintuitive, and in some ways it is. And yet the central symbol of Italian fascism is the fasces, this bundle of sticks that were carried by the lictors in ancient Rome, and was until the 1920s and 1930s a central Republican symbol of unity. So, if you look at the Lincoln Memorial and you look at his arms underneath Lincoln's arms, he's got two fasces. There are two fasces on the rostrum of the House of Representatives in Congress today, which may lead people to chuckle, but there they are, and they were at least historically central Republican Democratic symbols of unity and of equality. And so it turns out that there's a long reflection on fascist notions of equality, which actually I think tell us something about how equality functions as an organizing principle in other venues as well. So. But yeah, as you point out, got lots of different ideas of equality, and sorting them and sifting them becomes part of the exercise. I took I made the decision in this one to do less of the splicing and dicing that has been done traditionally by philosophers, and look at them more together. And that, if you're being critically minded, can mean that the book is a little messier than it might be. But I also think it's important not to make too fine philosophical distinctions between, equality of ends, means, political equality, civic equality, gender equality, social and economic equality, because historical actors themselves very often allow them to bleed one into the other. And I think this is one of the reasons why equality has such a kind of power in its association to justice. Anyway, that's one of the cases and arguments I make. The other thing I would say, you pointed this out vis-a-vis happiness, is that, and we started by saying that concepts and words are not the same thing. And, when you were talking, I thought, well, when I'm looking at the concept of happiness, you've got all kinds of words that come there: contentment and joy, discontent, as you say, or unhappiness. They're all embedded in the kind of word cloud of things that surround and form the concept. And the same is very much true with genius, creativity, and with equality. And so to get at these things involves going down a lot of rabbit holes and looking at ideas as they kind of manifest themselves in different registers. And that almost drove me mad in the case of equality, doing the research, because I think this was the most capacious of all the works that I'd done, and it really involved me in a lot of different literatures, from anthropology to queer and gender studies to modern economics and political philosophy, and all kinds of areas, which is really part of the fun, and I think that's why I'm sort of constitutionally wired to do these kinds of works. I'm just interested in a lot of things, but it also created a lot of anxiety, because I constantly felt like the thing that I was searching for was kind of slipping between my fingers, and I was going off in search of it in other places.
Well, in a way, it's frustrating, right? Because I think that we naturally want to have Whig history everywhere, right? We all want to have some teleological story, right? Where, like the arc of justice, is bending in the right direction or whatever. We all want to think that way. But when you dig into the details, it's never so simple. I mean, even simply, Protestantism, right? I mean, we all want to think, oh, well, Protestants came along and now, boom, we have more equality or more inequality. But of course, we got more both, right? I mean, it's consistent with
Exactly.
with both compared to its predecessors. It's very frustrating.
One of the arguments I make in the book is that equality always serves or always brings into being new forms of inequality. That the very assertion of equals then creates the space then for thinking or measuring others against that standard, and relegating the place of the
so
other.
now we're all equally positioned to interpret the Bible, but now grace is handed out
Right.
Sort
Some
of,
are closer to God than others.
right?
I have a colleague, an American colleague who teaches at Oxford, Teresa Bejan, who's a political philosopher, historian of political thought, who's in the process of publishing what will be a really important book on the history of equality with Harvard. And Teresa likes to say that equality is the last great Whig idea, and you referred to kind of the Whig history, this idea that everything leads to us. And I think there's been, for a long time, until relatively recently, this sense that yes, equality leads to us, and then it's going to spread and spill down to more and more people. It will expand and get wider. I grew up in California. I was born in 1965 with that kind of vague idea, and no one said it was going to be easy. Martin Luther King certainly knew it wasn't going to be easy, and yet, as you say, the arc of history bends towards justice, bends towards equality. We're gradually extending equality to wider and wider circles of people, and that's just how it'll go. And I think, we were deceived by our own rhetoric. And it was a rude awakening in 2016 to wake up and realize, oh gosh, it doesn't quite work that way. And as rude an awakening as that's been, I think it also provides an opportunity then to go back and examine a concept like equality that we thought we knew in some ways, but that really turns out to be much more complicated and fraught than I think we fully appreciated.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, folks like the French revolutionaries and Marx, I mean, we tend to think of them as being the advocates of equality, but they were sort of ambivalent about different types of equality. Marx was not a huge fan of equality as much as one would think.
Yeah, so this is quite a revelation. I mean, the French revolutionaries, that they have a place for equality, certainly liberty, equality, and fraternity, as you know. But one of the points I make in the book is that structurally equality almost always, it always is predicated on an understanding, whether explicit or implicit, of inequality. And the French revolutionary case illustrates this really well, right? So one of the points I make, I start the book by invoking what the Jacobins, the most radical French revolutionaries, call the scythe of equality. The scythe of equality is the guillotine.
Literally, right?
And you when you've got people are too tall, you got to chop off their heads, right? It's like the
It's like the
Australians have this.
Procrustean bed, right?
Yeah, exactly. The Australians have this nice phrase, the tall poppy syndrome, right? You get too big for your britches, then we cut off the tall poppy so that they're all the same. And the
And that
Jacobins,
goes back. You actually went all the way back to our primate ancestors, right? So Christopher Boehm and Richard Wrangham. I mean, they have this whole story about how tall poppy syndrome. Our ancestors were big advocates of
yeah,
knocking down the big dog.
totally. So look, I mean, we're opening all kinds of parentheses here, and they're interesting. But as you point out, I mean, I write a whole chapter on kind of early, the anthropology of early societies. And, I think it's very clear on the one hand that we are hierarchical beings. Don't have to tell a story here that's overly programmatic, but, we share most of our DNA with higher primates, with the great apes, and these tend to be intensely hierarchical beings. And that's just in us. Wherever human beings assemble in groups, they form hierarchies, and that's who we are, and we need to kind of face that. At the same time, though, as you point out, there's something in us that fights against those hierarchies, right? That pulls down the pretender, the alpha, the person who will try to lord it or dominate over the others, and that becomes an anthropological story. It's told, as you say, by people like Christopher Boehm and others, and I think those kind of twin impulses are always operating in us. On the one hand, we like distinction, hierarchy. This allows for order. It settles questions of distribution. It makes life easier in some ways. And yet, hierarchy, which is socially sanctioned, can very quickly tip over into domination, which is not and that makes us mad. We don't like domination, even if it's fun to dominate others, and so we push back against this. And this is at play in the whole history of equality, very, very, very much so. But you mentioned French Revolutionary, so that kind of push-pull is at play. The same Jacobins who are using the guillotine, of course, cutting off the heads of those they describe as aristocrats. Most of the aristocrats they kill in the Terror aren't actually aristocrats; they're just ordinary people whom they dislike for one reason or another, who are deemed unequal or unfit for equality, and therefore are factored out. And that's a particularly kind of violent and flagrant way of looking at a phenomena that really just plays out over and over again. So, when the founding fathers, of course, talk about equality, well, they only mean a certain circumscribed group, and they continue to defend that view, some people into the present day. So that's at play. You mentioned Marx, though, and this was another, for me at least, one of the real revelations of the research is I think most people, may have some kind of vague association, vague understanding of the writing and thought of Marx and Engels, just assume that they stand for and are fighting for equality. And in fact, this is not the case at all. They're quite explicit. I have a whole chapter on this in their kind of rejection of notions of equality, not just liberal democratic notions of equality as you would expect, but socialist ideas of equality that they see as a kind of crude and leveling.
So like Owen and Fourier and those guys, right?
Right. So the early kind of unscientific socialists, but even the later, German democratic socialists who do make equality a kind of explicit aim. In the famous kind of statement of principles of the German Social Democratic Party announced at the Thuringian city of Gotha in I'm forgetting the date, 1870 something. Marx writes this famous critique of the Gotha program in which he makes it very clear that, the abolition of equality is not the aim of communism. The aim of communism is the abolition of class struggle. But there's no suggestion anywhere in Marx that will lead to material, social, even political equality. And I think this is something still kind of just seems counterintuitive to folks, and yet when you get into the texts themselves, you see it's there. I have a friend, the economist you're familiar with, I'm sure, Branko Milanovic, who's just written a really fine book on a kind of history of thinking about equality and inequality in economic thought. And he makes the point there that, the Soviets aren't interested at all in income or wealth inequalities. They don't study it. They don't keep records on it because it doesn't fit in their kind of mental frame. Get rid of class distinctions and you don't have to worry about other things. They will take care of themselves. So as a consequence, there's no kind of data gathered on income and wealth inequality in the Soviet sphere. At the same time, in the capitalist world, we're not much interested in inequalities either. So there's this strange kind of confluence in the 1950s and 1960s, and it's really only relatively recently that economists have started to study inequality in depth, which is, again, I think a kind of surprising thing, but turns out to be the case.
And folks like Marx, I mean, they would really work hard to try to distance themselves from kind of a millenarian view of things. I mean, they would try to say, oh, no, that's not what we're all about. But at the end of the day, I mean, it seems like what you have is sort of religious elements, right, in the pursuit of equality. I mean, in your book, you actually talk about the religion of genius and the religion of happiness. I mean, it seems like all three of these have religious elements to them in the modern world.
I think that's right. I'm interested in religion. I've studied religion, and it's always been part of my kind of understanding of intellectual history. In the case of equality, well, in both the case of genius and happiness, they're clear, kind of religious associations, connotations, overlaps. But I think this is also the case in equality. I have a chapter on Christian ideas. Well, I have a chapter on
Saint-Simon. I mean, Saint-Simon was very right.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Like Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon was very,
right. So
very Christian in a way.
Yeah, in many ways, right, later. But I have a whole chapter on Christian ideas of equality in the ancient world and the Reformation. I have a chapter on ideas of equality in the main religious traditions, and they're there. I love to point out that, if you look up the word equality in early modern dictionaries in the Indo-European languages or Christian cultures, the first and really often the only entry will be to the Trinity. Why? Because God is co-equal and co-eternal. Right?
Right.
Quality, it defines the three persons of the Trinity. And in fact, if you go into a Christian church to this day, you'll often see above the altar a
Yeah.
equilateral triangle, which is the oldest symbol for the Trinity. And it interestingly also becomes then the Mason symbol for
Yeah. And we've
equality.
got on the dollar bill, sort of.
Exact. Well, yeah. So that's a pyramid. I
Sort
always
of missing
point
the
out a
top.
pyramid
But
of power, but
yeah.
it's close. And a lot of Masons use the triangle, and then it becomes the principal symbol for equality in the French Revolution, one of many, but a central one. So that's a
Liberty,
nice kind of way
equality.
in which these kind of Christian or religious precedents then find their way into modern understandings. You mentioned Saint-Simon, you mentioned kind of early socialists. I mean, there's this wonderful letter that I cite in the book that Engels, actually not a letter, it's an article he writes for Owen's, the utopian socialist Owen in the UK. He writes it in English, and he says, the only communists in France are Christians. The Christians are communists, and there are in fact a lot of Christian communists running around in the 1830s and 1840s who were explicit in their desire to bring about total material equality. And Engels poo-poos this, as being silly. But I think, as you suggest, there's a way in which some of those religious and millenarian longings do find their way into the tradition. Something that, of course, Marx and Engels themselves were always, dogmatically denied, and many of their successors and followers. And there's still a long debate, but I stand on the side of those who see a connection between the Marxian tradition and the religious traditions that precede it.
Now, another set of themes that goes through all three books, I think, is, this idea of born versus made, right? So, is happiness some intrinsic characteristic, or is it something that you make for yourself, right? Same with genius, right? Is it a product of your discipline and effort, or is it just something you can't help? And same with equality. And then also kind of like the nomos fusis debate, right?
Yeah.
Like is how much in our natural state, right? Are we, and of course, you spend a lot, you talk about Rousseau quite a bit. I mean, in our natural state, are we equal or unequal? What does society do to us? Are we happy or unhappy? And then what does society do to us? I see these themes in all three books.
Yeah, thank you. This is really great for me because you're pointing out things that I think I'm not even fully consciously aware of. But yes, these are through lines for sure. The born not made. I mean, this becomes the central distinction in thinking about genius in the 18th century, right? Are geniuses born or are they made? Can you play the guitar for 10,000 hours a la Malcolm Gladwell and become a Beatle? Or, is there just something in you? And that turns out to be a kind of central conflict going all the way back to the ancients. Same, as you say, with happiness, right? Is happiness just in our genes? We know some people are wired to, just be cheery in the morning, right? I'm not one of those people. But
Or it
some
happens
are.
to you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just
Or does it happen to you, right? Or can you make it, right? Can you control your life in such a way so that you can bring about happiness? And the same with equality, right? Are we born equals? Are we made equals in political circumstance? Are we intended to be equal? This too gets tied up with debates around it, around the concept from very early on, and they never really entirely go away. So again, it's a nice way of kind of pointing out continuities, but then also marking points of departure and change.
now, of course, there's a couple characters that seem to pop up in all of your books, right? So, Schopenhauer is one, of course. I think you're someone who enjoys his work. Nietzsche shows up. Carlyle shows up. Augustine is there. I mean, apart from the usual suspects like Plato, of course. But I mean, do you find this idiosyncratic? I mean, it seems like a lot of your idiosyncratic interests and the kinds of authors that you go back to over and over again, they pop up in these histories.
I think that's right. And I think, this is, look, we don't use the word greatness very often, and it makes us uncomfortable, and for good reason. Uh, but, great thinkers do exist, and they tend to think about a lot of things. Um, so it's funny. I mean, I do write about Schopenhauer in a couple of the books. Nietzsche is in all my works, Rousseau, Marx, and they just have views on lots of things. They're, fruitful places to mine. But you're right. There are idiosyncratic elements to this, no doubt. I have favorite thinkers, or kind of favorite go to. When I think about early Christianity, I go to Augustine. I got lots of books by him on my shelves, and I know his
Ambrose is in there too.
Exactly. I mean, there are lots of different folks, and again, I've tried to get away from just writing a history of high ideas. And this is one of the criticisms leveled against Lovejoy and company, that they were kind of out of touch with ordinary thinking. And I like to say, it's my uh, go-to line, that the humanities are too important to leave to the professors and to the eggheads. That the humanities belong to humanity itself, and that so many of these questions, what is creativity, and how do you cultivate it? What is happiness or well-being? Equality. These are concerns, or ought to be, for almost everyone. And so it's incumbent upon us scholars to try to write in such a way that we can reach, I think, broader audiences, or talk in fora like this one, and two, to leaven our sources, so that we're not just kind of having these masturbatory conversations amongst ourselves, but accessing people who reach out and speak to wider audiences. And I think that is possible, and I think in one way. On one level, that's why the history of religion has always appealed to me, because religion then becomes a vehicle via practice for translating what can be pretty sophisticated ideas to really widely varied groups of people.
And so, I guess set of questions. I mean, what is the role of history now in the humanities and the social sciences? I mean, I think if you're an economist, you probably don't read a lot of history of economics. If you're a psychologist, you don't read a lot of history of psychology. You
Yeah.
don't even no one even reads Freud anymore. If you're a psychologist, you're only looking at empirical studies and so forth. I mean, is there something lost there? I mean, what are these social scientists missing by failing to engage in, I don't know, the contingencies, and
Sure.
the fact that these debates have been going on for a long time? I mean, do you think that we should have a history of psychology, history of economics, history of sociology baked into our social science curriculum, particularly for grad students?
No question. I think the history of disciplines is hugely important, and I think economists in particular would benefit a great deal from looking at the history of their discipline. I mean, this is something that Branko points out. They just don't know it often, and it can lead to reinventing the wheel, or kind of falling into all kinds of traps. I have a group, a reading group, and they're almost all psychologists in the reading group, and we read, at their instigation, William James's The Principles of Psychology. It took us, over a year, and we, read a chapter a session. But this is a work, a kind of founding work in the American psychological tradition, that none of the psychologists had read. I'd read some James, but it was very funny because, in reading it, I was reading it as a historian, and they were reading it as psychology, sort of sifting what's worth keeping in this, and what do we throw out. And that tends to be the social scientist's view of past work, right? If it's not relevant to us anymore, then we ignore it. And I think, you do that at a cost. Historians are good on these things, and they can dredge up and point out where, there are cycles, where there are repetitions, where there are points of contact. I mean, my colleagues will say often that what historians do is, they leaven the general with the particular, that what we do are tell particular stories in particular places, at particular times, in particular contexts, that defy or push back, or sometimes illustrate the general assertions that our social scientist colleagues make. Now, I say our social scientist colleagues. At Dartmouth, history is housed in the social sciences, and many colleges and universities is, but at others, it's in the humanities. I think of myself really more as a humanist than a social scientist, but there are these kind of overlaps, to be sure. And I think history is really well placed to translate some of the insights of the humanists to the social scientists and back. And I see us in some ways as a kind of liminal discipline, one that I think is really critical right now. I've been saying recently to colleagues and friends that well, one, I like history better when it's in the past, and we're living in a moment when history is in our face every day, but that's how it is, and we need to lead into it. And that actually times of crisis and upheaval, for all their shortcomings, are good for history and historians. We're seeing our majors tick up, and this is happening in other places around the country because I think people are realizing that CNN is not going to give them the insight that they need to understand the times in which they live, and that we need the stories that historians can tell us in order to kind of understand our lives. And so I think this role is actually more crucial now than ever, at a time when our kind of time horizon has shrunk to the quarterly earnings report. That's about how far out we think about the future, let alone the past. And there's a real need, I think, to expand our vision, or otherwise we end up being locked in these little narrow slices of time in which we live, which in the grand scheme of things are just, really tiny.
And what's unique about the intellectual historian? I mean, because in philosophy departments, we do have history of philosophy. And I remember when I was studying intellectual history in grad school, one of my advisors said, the problem with a lot of people who are doing this, such as myself, is that, you're trying to evaluate the ideas and figure out whether they make sense or not. And as an historian, you have to refrain from doing that all the time and focus on sort of how ideas lead to ideas and how they sort of interact with each other. And you have to kind of hold your judgment in suspense to some degree.
Absolutely.
I mean, is that the unique contribution of an intellectual historian, as opposed to, say, someone within those disciplines who was doing some historical research?
Yeah, I think it's one of them. I mean, in many ways, I think all historians ought to function that way, but they don't. I mean, we've witnessed several decades of effectively people standing in judgment of the past. There are a lot of things
Presentism.
I don't like. Yeah. But my task as a historian is not first and foremost to castigate and to, point out the winners and losers and pass judgment, but rather to understand. I sometimes tell my undergraduates, grandiloquently, that they can't learn how to love if they don't know history. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, intellectual history teaches you to get inside the minds of others who see the world in radically different ways from how you do. And, that's what love is all about, trying to get inside the mind of a person who sees the world differently from you, and to empathize even when you don't agree, to understand even when you don't condone. That's crucial. It's a crucial human endeavor. And I think intellectual history teaches that very well. When I wrote my chapter on, fascist understandings of equality, I certainly wasn't in sympathy with them. But, the challenge became, well, how do I understand the way that they see the world, right? Because if I can do that, then maybe I can then, get a little closer to sort of putting it into context and to, making some kind of sense of it. And sometimes, understanding does lead to a greater empathy. Not always. Sometimes it leads to greater revulsion. But I think, as you point out, that the task of the good intellectual historian is to reserve or to withhold judgment and to seek, first and foremost, to understand.
Well, Darrin, thanks so much. You think you've succeeded in that effort in all three of these books. I recommend them all. Take them on a plane with you like I did for the last couple of weeks. And I'm definitely going to check out that fourth book. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Greg. It was a real pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.